Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Doug Surratt, who is VP of International Solutions at MercuryGate. And today we're going to talk about the benefits of taking a holistic and integrated approach to transportation management. Now, this idea of really, again, taking an integrated and holistic perspective of transportation management is not new. I mean, we've been talking about this for many, many years. But I think what's still interesting is that despite the fact that we've seen the needle move in the right direction over the years, there's still a lot of companies that are still taking that kind of siloed perspective to transportation management, both from a process perspective as well as a technology perspective. And I think it's always important to continue to underscore the importance of taking a holistic and integrated approach. And then obviously with the continued advancements in technology and kind of more success stories out there, I think it's important to keep, talking about this and kind of showcasing the opportunities here. And certainly happy to have Doug on the program here, who brings a wealth of experience to this topic, and certainly look forward to his insights on it. Before we get started, I just want to remind all of you that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So if you do have a question for Doug, as we're going through our conversation here, you can do so via the submit a question button or via the chat feature. And if it's a good and appropriate question, I'll try to weave it into the conversation. If you are joining us as a visitor, you do have to sign in first before you're able to ask a question. So with that, Doug, welcome to the program.
Adrian, thank you. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to our time today.
So Doug, before we kind of dive into the topic, whenever I have a new guest on the program, I always like to find out, how and why they got into, supply chain logistics to begin with. So why don't you briefly, tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved in supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at MercuryGate.
So I know I don't look that old with this beautiful head of hair that I have here, but I've actually been in the industry for quite a long time. I started my career back in 1988 and started at United Parcel Service, which is a great place to start. And I was there for 10 years. I really, when I started there, did not envision kind of supply chain and logistics being my long-term career. I actually started and thought I was on kind of an IT trajectory, but really fell in love with transportation, logistics, and supply chain. And after 10 years at Big Brown, I went to work for a software company at the time known as McHugh Freeman, later became McHugh Software, later became Red Prairie. And when I left Red Prairie, I was managing the transportation practice for the consulting business there. And I was there 10 years as well. So between those two places, 20 years. I left the software industry for 5 years and did consulting, had my own little consulting business, working with folks who were doing WMS, TMS, and global trade management solutions. And one of the companies I kept running into was MercuryGate, and I worked through selections with clients, implementations with clients, and everything I saw about MercuryGate honestly impressed me. And 2.5 years ago, I joined MercuryGate. So my role at MercuryGate is to manage the kind of the global part of the business. So I've got responsibility for what we're doing outside the U.S. primarily, and we're seeing a lot of interest in certainly this topic and in growth outside of the United States. It's a great opportunity for us and a great market for us as a provider. So we're very excited about it.
Yeah, Doug, I mean, your career path kind of underscores one of the big topics that I've been talking about this year, which is convergence, right? So I've been talking about the convergence of the business models of logistics service providers, technology companies, and consultants. And kind of looking back at your career path, I mean, you started out at a logistics service provider, then technology, then consulting, and then now in technology. And certainly I think there's great synergy between those three things, and I think we're going to continue to see that moving forward. So let's get into the topic now. I mean, like I alluded to in my opening comments, historically, companies treated international, transportation separately from domestic, much the same way that they treated inbound separately from outbound. Are you seeing companies kind of today taking a more holistic and integrated perspective? And if so, what's driving that change?
Yes, we are. And one of the really fascinating things, I think, is the kind of the saturation and also the sophistication of the U.S. market, particularly, in the logistics community. We work with a lot of companies, and I've worked with a lot of companies who are providing logistics services for other organizations. And we've done a pretty good job in the U.S. of developing some fantastic technology and, frankly, some really strong domain expertise relative to supply chain and transportation. And so what we're seeing is a lot of folks are looking to grow their business either as a shipper who is going after new markets outside the U.S. or as a logistics provider who has sort of saturated the market in the U.S. and really looking for ways to continue to grow. In a lot of cases, their eyes go to countries outside the United States, and so we're seeing a lot of growth in this area. We're seeing a lot of shippers who are growing outside the U.S. We're seeing, obviously, some of that happens through acquisition, but a fair bit of it is also just growth in new markets. And then on the logistics provider side, we're seeing a lot of companies who are really searching for ways to continue the growth rates when perhaps they may be pretty well established in the U.S. market, and markets outside the U.S. are still pretty wide open. So there's always different reasons why companies go in a more sort of international focused direction. But one of the things that we see really driving that is just, frankly, just the growth opportunities in the market itself. And what's really fascinating about that, at least in my mind, is, and I know we'll probably dive into this in a little more detail later, but one of the fascinating things is the way that U.S. companies tend to approach the international market. And obviously it's very different. And so we're seeing companies who are successfully making that transition into, let's say, the European market or the Latin American market or the Asian market, and then others who are struggling. And so it's a really interesting thing to watch and to observe and to kind of highlight those areas where people struggle and where they succeed.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it sounds like, I guess, to paraphrase a little bit, is that as companies, both whether they're shippers or 3PLs, are looking for growth opportunities, a lot of those growth opportunities involve becoming much more international, right? And whether it's expanding globally, whether it's serving customers in other locations, whether it's serving sourcing from other countries and bringing that in, so on and so forth. So really, this globalization that companies have been talking about now, and that's been happening now for many, many years, seems to be kind of that driving force that is forcing companies to kind of take that more holistic perspective. Is that a fair kind of summation?
It's a very fair summation, and for us, it's interesting because we do work with a lot of logistics companies, and many of them are, like I said, they've saturated their market in the U.S. and they're really, the next growth opportunity, at least in their minds, it seems very logical to go outside the U.S. And so it really is often driven by growth, and of course, there's all kinds of challenges that go with that. But to your point, it's really a function of going after new markets, whether it's in your own integrated supply chain, sourcing out of new countries, that sort of thing, or it's simply as a logistics provider who, frankly, needs new customers to continue the growth pace that they've been on.
Yeah, so let's talk about kind of to continue on the topic here of international. Let's talk about international transportation, which in most cases involves air and ocean transportation. I mean, what are some of the biggest challenges companies face in planning and executing international shipments, and how does the process differ from domestic, right? So if you're a small company or if you're a company that's just starting out in international transportations, what are some of those big differences that they're going to encounter that say, gosh, that's very different from what we do here domestically?
Right. And, fundamentally, certain aspects of transportation are the same in any country. But one of the things that's very interesting is because we, certainly in the United States, is seen as a world leader in logistics and transportation and supply chain, we tend to go into other markets with a kind of a bias and not only technology but also expertise and process with regard to how transportation and logistics and supply chain need to be managed. And so, we've got great technology in the U.S. We've got great process in the U.S. We've got great domain expertise in the U.S. But that all doesn't necessarily translate to other countries. In fact, what I've found is that companies that are the most successful go into these new markets with maybe a little more flexibility and a little more open-mindedness than sort of saying, we're going to go in with everything that's worked in the U.S. Because everything that works in the U.S. does not work outside the U.S. And I know that sounds very obvious and very simple, but even some of the things that we do with regard to optimization, I'll give you a very, very simple example. There are certain countries in the EU that do not allow a carrier to drive a load through that country on a weekend. So you might have an optimization tool that can do a fantastic job of minimizing miles and streamlining the routes and reducing costs and so on. But if you put a truck on the road through a particular country that does not allow you to drive through that country on the weekend, and you've got a problem. So it's not as simple as saying we've got the right technology and we've got the right domain expertise. You really do, as you go into these new markets, you really have to be thoughtful and careful about the nuances that are unique to that country, and those nuances create constraints that sometimes reduce efficiency, reduce productivity, but nonetheless the constraints are there and they have to be addressed to be successful.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I want to get back to that because I think when you think about from a technology standpoint in terms of deploying a solution, and in particular if you're looking to deploy it across different divisions that may operate in different geographic regions, how do you do that in a way that allows for that kind of localization, if you will, or for the local constraints and local operating realities to be different, as you operate across different countries, but yet still have the same tool, right? So I want to get back to that question, but first, let's start at a higher level with the with TMS. I mean, years ago, if you were looking for a TMS and that handled both domestic and international shipments, and if you were doing also parcel and fleet management, you were talking about implementing, maybe 3 or 4, different solutions. Today we're seeing those capabilities kind of converge into single platforms. So as a result, I mean, what can companies do today, and what benefits can they achieve that they couldn't in the past?
No, that's a great point. In fact, we're seeing some very interesting combinations start to show up in some of the folks that we're talking with. For example, we have a company that we work with who has multi-leg shipments. The first leg of every shipment is actually a parcel shipment. It's going with a parcel carrier in the U.S., and it's being delivered to an airport, to a gateway facility, and from there it's put onto an air container and mixed in with a bunch of other parcel shipments that are consolidated together and sent overseas to another location. So, it is the world is changing. It's not just a traditional truckload LTL parcel world anymore. It's multimodal, it's omnimodal, it's a mix of modes on the same movement, and even sometimes modes that you wouldn't necessarily think fit together, like parcel and air freight on the same leg, or I'm sorry, on the same shipment. So what's fascinating to me is, over the years, like you've indicated, customers traditionally look at the market as a kind of a niche solution sort of market approach. I've got a solution that handles my small parcel. I've got a solution that handles my air freight. I've got a solution that handles my ocean freight. And in the example that I just gave you, where you have a single shipment that's traveling on both a parcel leg and then an air freight leg, those traditionally would not go together. But unless you've got a system now that can put those together into one place, yes, you might be able to manage the parcel end of the process in one place, and you might be able to manage the air freight leg in another place. But what happens when that parcel shipment is late? When it doesn't make the delivery to the airport on time for some reason, whatever that reason is, how does the lateness of that leg impact the ability to move that air container on the next leg? Well, there's obviously an impact there. So you might be able to execute those two things in separate isolated systems, but without a comprehensive platform that can understand the impact that that the realities in one system have on the abilities of the other system to execute, it's very difficult to do. And then you layer on top of that, looking at profitability across the entire move. I might have revenue considerations across both legs. I might have cost considerations across both legs. And when things happen on one, how does it impact the other from a revenue perspective? All of that becomes very, very difficult to do in multiple systems. Is it possible to do it? Yes, but it's very complex, and the cost to implement those systems, integrate them in such a way that you can have that sort of dynamic ability to manage across all these different modes, it's very difficult to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the things that particularly when companies are really looking at transforming the way they are fulfilling orders, transforming the way that they're flowing product, right? Where now you're getting into these situations where they're using modes that they haven't used in the past, or they're really, combining, different modes together. Really, number one starts with that visibility, right? And being able to see the entire process being executed. And to your point, I think, the question always comes is what happens when the exceptions occur, right? Because that's usually when, the challenges of having a lot of different systems, come into play in terms of being able to manage those exceptions as quickly and as effectively as possible. So you've got that kind of diversity of modes and potential challenges there and opportunities there by having a single platform. Now, let's talk about kind of what we talked about earlier, what you brought up earlier, kind of these local differences in terms of how do you operate a transportation operation in different geographic regions. I mean, how does the technology platform come into play? How does it enable that ability to manage at a local level, yet perhaps roll everything up to have a single view of what's happening?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of key parts to that problem. First part of the problem is there's a challenge in collecting the information or the data that is needed to understand a particular market. So, in the global trade example, just knowing which countries you can travel through on a weekend, with a common carrier, there's some information gathering that has to take place there. So that's not an insignificant problem. Gathering that data, collecting it, knowing where to collect it from, maintaining that information, of course, is obviously a very significant effort. But once it's collected, then it needs to be systematized. It needs to be directed at people and processes and technology who can use that information. So it's not just enough to have the data collected about these constraints from country to country, but once once that information is known, then of course you have to be able to act intelligently on that. So first step is to gather. Second step is to use. And then the third part of that is you still have to have people who have some domain expertise in these areas. Air freight is air freight at the end of the day. The common concepts in air freight are not that different from one country to the next. But all those geographical differences related to global trade have a dramatic impact on whether or not you can move air freight outside the U.S. the way you do in the U.S. So to me, what's really interesting is a platform has to be able to, number one, facilitate the collection of information, and number two, it has to facilitate the systemization of that information, and then it has to be able to translate that systemization into empowerment and capability for the people that are using it. So, having obviously a single platform is advantageous in the sense that you've got one place to collect the data, you've got one place to systematize it, and one place to distribute it. But at the same time, whether you have a system or not, those challenges exist. And so we're seeing a lot of customers who are looking at the technology market as a way to help solve all three of those problems. Number one, collect the data. Number two, systematize it. And number three, put it into a workflow process or into a presentation layer that makes it intuitive for the user and gives them that sort of domain expertise that they need to manage the process effectively. Again, doing that across multiple systems is just very, very difficult to do.
You just touched upon some of this already, but maybe just to round out, this part of the conversation. I mean, what capabilities should companies then look for in a TMS, moving forward, particularly if they have both domestic and international, shipping operations?
I think first and foremost, you really need a system that can handle all modes. And I know that sounds very simple and obvious, but having a system that's great for truckload and LTL, but can't do air, can't do parcel, is obviously going to be a limiting factor in your ability to grow as either a shipper or a logistics provider. And there's some great point solutions out there. Some that do parcel very well, and there's some that do ocean very well, and some that do air very well. But those solutions fall down when it comes to looking at sort of the broader community of modes and opportunities. So first and foremost, I think we like to use the term omnimodal, but the ability to handle every mode is very important. And secondly, the ability to take, as I talked about earlier, kind of taking data and acting on it in a workflow kind of way is very important. So having the information and then systematizing it so that the users are guided through a process of managing a shipment instead of having a user have to know exactly what to do in every case and have to anticipate all of the requirements, constraints, challenges associated with a shipment is also something important. So I think any solution that you're considering needs to have a very solid kind of a workflow process that can guide a user rather than expecting a user to know exactly what to do and which buttons to click on in the application to process something through successfully. So, of course, when you're working with a workflow engine, it's important to understand your own processes and to know how those processes need to be translated to a system. And there's a lot of thought and intelligence that needs to go into that. But assuming that work is done well, then the end result is a system that is leading and guiding users, but relying on their expertise to execute the processes. But it's not relying on their expertise to drive the system. The system is guiding the user using their knowledge to fill in the edges, rather than a kind of a white or an open chalkboard, waiting for the customer or the user to come in and kind of do whatever they feel like. So again, it's about having a solution that can handle all the modes. Certainly, it's about having a solution that can handle the collection and the distribution of information, and then really a system that can provide a structured workflow so that the users can use it in a relatively simple way.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I mean, I think to that last point, I mean, I think one of the things that we're going to see more and more of moving forward, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is on the solutions becoming much more prescriptive, particularly when exceptions occur, right? So I think it's one thing to define a workflow and have the system help guide the user through the defined process flow, right? But it's when those exceptions occur, particularly at impact transportation, a lot of times the user says, well, what are my options and what's the impact of each of those options? And for a TMS, I don't think anyone's quite there yet fully, but I think moving forward, I think the expectation, I think the desire is for the TMS to say, well, here's what went wrong, right? And not just point it out, but to say, here are three potential actions you can take and the impact on cost, the impact on service level, or so forth, and then let the user kind of decide which one is the best option based on other knowledge that he or she might have, right? So your thoughts on that? Do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, actually we do, and it's really interesting you bring that up because it's a fundamental part of a good workflow engine is to be able to handle or be made aware of those exceptions when they occur and present those exceptions to a user in such a way that it gives them enough information to make a good decision as to what to do next. So, I mean, to your point, and it's a very, very solid point, is exceptions are going to occur. So it's really having a system that can capture those and present them in a very easily digestible way to the user, and then give them, like you said, options so that they know what to do next. And obviously, expertise for the user comes into play there, but having a system that can present the appropriate options to them, appropriate legitimate options, and then give them the ability to execute those, and then potentially steer down a completely different path in the workflow based on the fact that the option B was chosen instead of option A. So the workflow part of it is really important. But at the end of the day, what it's really about is presenting to the user the data that they need in a way that they need it, so that they can make intelligent decisions, and then giving them the capability to act on those decisions quickly and not have to go outside the process to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole buzz term around making smarter decisions faster, and I think that's where ultimately this whole area of BI and analytics is coming, moving toward, is to be able to provide those kind of insights and that intelligence, right? So it's no longer enough to send an alert to say this shipment's going to be late or something to that effect. The next logical question is, well, what do I do about it, right? And being able to provide some insightful information and recommendations to help speed up that decision process, I think is going to be a key moving forward. We're kind of running short on time here, so I've got just a couple of more questions. We're approaching 2015, right? It's just a couple of weeks away. As we kind of head into this new year, what do you see as some of the biggest transportation, challenges ahead for shippers, both on the domestic and international side, and how can technology perhaps help, address those challenges?
Well, kind of go back a little bit to what I said earlier. I think one of the biggest challenges is, growth outside of your comfortable market. So we'll say it might not even be the U.S., but a lot of companies are looking for new ways to grow, and in many cases the answer is go outside the borders of where you are today. And I would challenge people as they do that and as they consider doing that, really take a thoughtful approach to those new markets. Don't go in trying to be all things to all people in all markets. Go in a targeted way and look at markets where you can be successful. As I said earlier, gather the data. Look for a system that can help you gather the data necessary to operate in that market. Systematize that data, and then look for expertise. Look for people who are strong in that market who can help you and have the local knowledge, the tribal knowledge, as we like to say sometimes, about that particular market. But it is really interesting because we've always talked about our industry as being kind of a global industry. It is becoming more and more global every day. And if anyone's involved in the automotive industry, they can attest to how many different countries are involved in the production of a single automobile. It's actually quite fascinating. So the world is becoming more and more global. It's necessarily then becoming more and more connected, and it's all the more imperative for logistics providers and shippers to have systems and, frankly, skill sets and people who can operate outside of kind of the current base of operations.
Yeah, no, great insight. So, so as a way to wrap up, then, what questions should companies ask themselves to kind of assess whether their transportation planning capabilities are best in class, from a from an integrated, holistic perspective, or if, they've got some room for improvement?
So there's obviously a lot of things to consider there, but I think just to touch on a few points again, the modal component is one that can't be understated. There's a need. There's going to be, if you don't have it today, there's going to be a need to operate with every mode. So if you've got a system that out of the box cannot handle certain modes, then that's potentially a giant red flag for what you need to be considering. And then that system also needs to have the capability to look at things that are related to the global trade problem, different constraints and regulations, frankly, around crossing borders. Things like, denied party screening, a real simple, obvious one, but you can't sell certain products to certain parties around the world. So how do you incorporate that denied party screening process into the transportation problem? If you're in the U.S. and you're moving a lot of air freight, then you're very familiar with the known shipper issue with the TSA. So again, having a system that can collect that data and present it to a user in such a way that they can use that information intelligently is very, very important. And as you look to go outside your comfort zone, outside your current markets, I would encourage you to look at certainly modes, and I would encourage you to look at the capabilities of the system with regard to its ability to help solve those global trade problems. How well can it manage, the different constraints that you have to manage when you go across borders into these different countries. So those are very high level, obviously, but two things that I think are just fundamental. Then one other third one that I think is really interesting and important is in the world we live in today, you've kind of got two traditional software models. You got the license deployment model and you got the SaaS model. And obviously, I work for a SaaS provider, so I'm a little biased to that approach. But one thing the SaaS model, multi-tenant model, multi-client model gives you is the ability to have all of the different divisional or operational entities in one system and not have to have separate databases, separate installs, separate logins, and all of that. So there's just some very practical things that you want to think about with regard to managing disparate operations around the world who might be using the system in the same way, might be using it in different ways, but really need to be all in the same system and have all the data kind of in one spot so you can see overall enterprise profitability and performance. So again, that's a kind of a simple one, but it's one that we're seeing more and more customers are saying, hey, we like or dislike solutions purely because of the fact that we can get to the system from anywhere and we don't have to separate, completely separate installs of the software to run our business.
Yeah, no, I agree with that last point. I mean, for a long time, I've been a huge proponent of, cloud-based or what I like to call network-based, solutions for many of the reasons you just talked about. And, to me, any business process, and certainly transportation management is one of them, that inherently involves a large number of external trading partners and information that needs to be exchanged with a lot of different external parties and a lot of different functional groups. I think that model, the kind of the cloud, the network-based model, has some inherent advantages and benefits, to it. Doug, like I always say, we always manage just to scratch the surface on this topic, but I think you've provided some great, food for thought and advice on this topic. And, this being our last episode of 2014, I can't think of a better topic to have ended on, and certainly a highlight for this season. And again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
You're welcome, Adrian. Thank you so much. Again, always a pleasure to talk with you, and we look forward to what 2015 is going to bring.
Great, and thank you, those of you that joined us live today. We didn't get any questions, but if you are watching this episode on demand, if you do have a question or a comment for Doug, you can find the episode on talkinglogistics.com. Post a question or comment there, and I'm sure that Doug will be more than happy to respond via that medium. So with that, thank you all, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.